All right, so I'm enjoying the Percy Jackson show. Enough. I've never read the books, as I said in my last video about this show, so I'm coming at it totally blind. It's definitely geared towards a younger audience, though I am a child at heart. But it's fun. It's fun. We'll see where it goes. I, however, am annoyed. I am annoyed with journalists and Hollywood writers. Imagine that. There's a piece in Variety. Variety is a useful publication. Lots of news and interesting stuff, interviews. But occasionally you get stuff like this. How Percy Jackson updated the book's Medusa storyline to get closer to the original myth. Quote, "She was a victim of rape," by Selum Helu. I have no idea how to pronounce that name. They talk a little bit about how in the Percy Jackson books, they don't get into the whole Medusa was raped thing. Maybe because they're kids' books, young adult books. I don't know. But here's an interesting statement of fact. In the original myth, Medusa is a human woman who takes a vow of celibacy out of devotion to Athena, the goddess of wisdom. However, Medusa eventually enters a relationship with sea god Poseidon that becomes sexual one night. Many interpretations posit that the encounter, which took place in Athena's temple, was non-consensual and that Poseidon raped Medusa. Athena decides to punish Medusa, robbing her of her beauty by turning her into a gorgon that petrifies anyone she makes eye contact with. So, that's not true. I'm not even a scholar of Greek antiquity, but I know that's not true. That's actually a version of the myth written by Ovid, hundreds of years after the myth itself took shape. Ovid was a contemporary of Emperor Augustus Caesar, and was exiled by him at one point, probably because Ovid was an anti-authoritarian who didn't really care for emperors. Ovid's work deals with, how the gods, he often makes the gods, frames the gods as very horrible, especially Athena, among others, is sort of a terrible monster themselves. So, of course, in Ovid's version of the Medusa story, she punishes this poor woman who was raped by a god. Poseidon doesn't come off too good in this story either. And she becomes this hideous monster who turns people to stone. But that's not the original myth. This is the original myth shit is just people in the modern era who want to cherry pick whatever they can to make it, fit a modern narrative. The original myth is that Medusa was a monster. She had monstrous siblings and was related to other monsters, and she was always just a monster. Now, it's a myth. It's not real, so it doesn't really matter. You can have lots of different versions, lots of different interpretations. But this is not the original myth. So in this article, calling it in the original myth, Medusa was a human who took... That's not true. That is a much, much later version of a much older myth. More from the article. Rebecca Reardon, who is married to Rick and executive produces the TV series, says that, quote, "The only reason Medusa is not more fleshed out in the books was that it was Percy's narrative and we don't have her perspective, as the books are written in first person. As a 12-year-old boy in 2005, I don't think he had the bandwidth for deconstructing the patriarchy," adds Rick. He was looking at it as, "This is a scary woman who's trying to turn me into stone." But that changed upon entering a TV writer's room where other perspectives became essential. "It was one of the first things we talked about, how to not have a patriarchal lens," Rebecca says, and I just want to break things. Not that I'm like a big fan of the patriarchy, but just because do they ever get tired of smelling their own farts? That's what I want to know. I mean, it's this, we'll call it, people like the Critical Drinker or whatever, they call it the message. I think it's more accurate to call it the overreaction. The overcorrection, maybe. The overcorrection, that's better. For many, 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 many years, for a long, long time, yeah, everything was really geared towards white dudes, right? Yeah, absolutely. The overcorrection is to then take everything about white dudes and make it bad, make it the patriarchy, find every myth we can, call it the original myth, even though that's not true, and make it about sexual assault, make Poseidon a rapist, make Medusa a victim. No, man, Medusa was a monster. She turned people into stone. She had to get killed by Perseus. It's okay to have monsters, and it's okay when they're female, because there are female monsters, and it's sexist to make women always good and men always bad. It's just not there. I just talked about Fargo. Fargo's doing this, unfortunately. It is positioning all the women as tough, strong, and smart, and all the men as evil or stupid. Except for Munch. He's just a wild card. And even Wayne, the husband of Dot, is, although a sweetheart, practically mentally disabled at this point. Slow Horses does a much better job of not doing this. It has strong women characters who are both likable and unlikable, capable, complicated, interesting characters who are both men and women. Doesn't matter if they're black or white. One of the primary villains in season 3 is a black lady. Another is a white dude. It allows its characters to be complicated and interesting regardless of their sex, gender, race, whatever. I am so glad that Slow Horses isn't trying so hard to not have a patriarchal lens, but is instead just being an organic story that can tell its story through various lenses. So, anyways, that's all I really wanted to say about this. Let's see. Here's the lines from the show. Here's Medusa. Athena was everything to me. I worshipped her. I prayed to her. I made offerings. She never answered. Not even an omen to suggest she appreciated my love, Medusa says. Then, correctly assuming that Annabeth isn't as close to her mother as she'd like to be, she adds, I wasn't like you, sweetheart. I was you. I would have worshipped her that way for a lifetime in silence. But then one day another god came and he broke that silence. Your father, she continues, now speaking to Percy. The sea god told me that he loved me. I felt as though he saw me in a way I'd never felt seen before. But then Athena declared that I had embarrassed her and I needed to be punished. Not him, me. She decided that I would never be seen again by anyone who would live to tell the tale. Percy Jackson co-creator and showrunner John Steinberg, who credits writer Daphne Olive for steering much of this storyline, explains how the episode gestures at the original myth, while keeping it age-appropriate. If you know what she's talking about, you know what she's talking about. If you're too young to be in that conversation, it won't bother you. You're just in a scene about this woman who seems complicated, and everybody's got an opinion about what went down. There's no version that is the version. If Athena and Poseidon were in that room, you'd get 3 different versions of that story. If you know... First of all, motherfuckers, nobody knows this story. Hardly anybody knows these stories. Look at this world we live in. Nobody knows Greek myth. Even though her character never uses the language of sexual assault, Kennedy felt resolute in her interpretation. John wrote a story of Medusa thinking that Poseidon was someone she could trust, and he broke that trust. She was feeling safe, and then the situation turned unsafe, she says. So I chose to play that she was a victim of rape and total abandonment, not understanding why Athena would turn on her. I don't know. I just don't think it's actually doing a great service to the cause of female empowerment, equality, to make a badass monster like Medusa just a rape victim, just a victim who's become a monster because of her victimhood. Doesn't that just feel a little trite? Yeah, I mean, I get what they're trying to go for here. Rick Riordan himself says there are many versions from ancient times of what happened in that temple with Medusa and Poseidon and Athena. Who's to blame? Who's the abuser? What's the real story? It's fiction, but it certainly is important to acknowledge that there's abuse involved here, abuse of power. Now, I'm fine with pushing that line, abuse of power, with making Medusa complicated, like ugly is not necessarily monstrous, so on and so forth. I get where they're going here, but it's this whole idea of like, first of all, bending the idea of the original myth, pretending, or just being ignorant of the fact that it's not in fact the original myth, not even close. It'd be like someone who took a Native American myth 800 years after that myth originated and was spread in folklore, taking that and like in Europe, turning it into a European story about the same character, and then 2,000 years after that, someone saying, that's the original myth. That's not. That was an appropriated myth that a Roman appropriated from the Greeks. I mean, I'm not big on the whole cultural appropriation thing. I think it's wildly stigmatized or whatever for the most part. But that's the reality. If you want to be really, really, really down to brass tacks here, this is a Roman interpretation. It's not the original myth. You're using that now for your own interpretation to make this story not through the patriarchal lens of a 12-year-old white kid. Can't have that, so we have to have whatever, this whole contrived bullshit. Now, at the same time, as I rant and ramble about how annoying it is when people, talk like this sort of gender studies language of patriarchy and the patriarchal lens. The really annoying part of this is that it's just like passing the football over to the people on the other side who are like, oh, those feminazis and talking about patriarchy. Now, look, man, the problem with this shit is not because there's feminazis or whatever or patriarchy. The problem is that people speak in absolutes and they lose all nuance, and we get this ridiculous, shallow, ideologically driven stories rather than actual character studies with nuance and depth and characters who are neither villains nor heroes, but who are interesting and complicated and compelling and dynamic. And all of that gets thrown out the window when we start talking in these terms of absolutes and ideologies and us versus them. And the story is what suffers. The story, the characters, that's what suffers in the end. And ultimately, if the story suffers, then so do we, the people who want to be told great stories and not constantly just preach to, or have people who are angry at the preaching preach their own bullshit. And then we just get rained on by shit, right? It's like the opening scene of Consider Phlebas. If you've ever read that book, you'll know what I'm talking about. You should. It's a good book. Anyways, thank you for watching. Like, subscribe. Let me know what you think of Percy Jackson down below. And all of this nonsense, of course. Hit the notification bell. Peace.